Gonzalez, co-founder of Gender Liberation Movement, and welcome to one of 4 roundtables for Trans Week of Visibility in Action, which GLM is hosting March 25th through the 31st. This week, we're making one sustained argument. Gender liberation is for everybody. So the fight for trans rights, lives, and liberation is connected to everyone's fight for bodily autonomy, self-determination, and the pursuit of fulfillment. Today's conversation sits right inside of that frame, and we think it's one that's overdue because trans migrants have been leading the fight against ICE and for liberation far much longer than the current moment. From Jiménez Gutierrez interrupting President Obama at a White House Pride event more than 10 years ago, to the Not One More campaign, to the End Trans Detention movement, to the deaths of so many folks, including Roxana Hernandez in custody. None of this fight is new. What is new is the scale. ICE has stripped rape protection from trans detainees. They've stopped publishing data on trans people in custody. So the machinery is expanding and the erasure is intentional. But this conversation is going to unveil many of the roots of this work, the people who built it, and what this fight demands of all of us. Our amazing panelists are Sol Jiménez Palacios, national organizer at Familia Trans Queer Liberation Movement; Oluchi Omeoga, co-executive director of the Black LGBTQIA+ Migrant Project, or BLMP; Tiara Gendi, fierce and free national organizer of the Black LGBTQIA+ Migrant Project; Mich Gonzalez, abolitionist movement lawyer, co-founder of the Southeast Dignity Not Detention Coalition; and Yuan Wang, Chinese American community organizer, the former executive director of Lavender Phoenix, and a current leading edge fellow with the Rosenberg Foundation. Thank you to the amazing panelists here. We're going to do a quick lightning round, and bear with me with my Southern accent, honey, because I'm trying to keep it all together. But I want to make sure that folks have an understanding of where folks are coming from, what their lens is. And so we're going to do a quick lightning round. And I'll start with you, Oluchi. Can you share a little bit more about your background and what brings you to this fight?
Hey, y'all. My name is Oluchi Omeoga. I use any pronouns. My parents are Nigerian immigrants. I was born in Minnesota. What really brings me to this work as a trans person who's also a child of immigrants is just thinking about how our transitions have always been criminalized, if it's through migration or if it's through gender identity and gender expression. I remember the thing that actually got me into organizing to begin with. I was in New York, and there was a campaign to decarcerate a Black trans woman from Minneapolis, and her name was Cece McDonald. And that case really shook me to my core because I was all the way in New York, but Cece was from Minneapolis, and that was like my city. And seeing the national organizing that was happening from thousands of miles away was really what activated me. And just thinking about how those who are most at the margins, specifically Black trans people, specifically Black trans migrant folks, are always going to be the ones that are going to be hit first and hit the hardest. So I dedicate my work to liberating Black trans people and in turn, trans people in general. And that's what really brings me to the work.
Beautiful. And I'll kick it to you, Mitch.
Mich Gonzalez, El Hide. I'm the trans son of Cuban immigrants from Miami. And in Miami, I grew up. Everyone in my community was an immigrant. Not everyone is privileged as Cuban immigrants in terms of paths to status. But what brings me to this moment has been my experience over the past 15 years of pretty much being in partnership and support of people detained. I would say hundreds of people from over 100 countries across maybe 25 detention centers. And usually that looks like legal representation, but primarily what it is just being a human witness to what people are going through and trying to help them reach their goals, whether it's liberation, family reunification. And so, yeah, that lived experience and more importantly, learning from them. And these are people who over half are queer or trans, the people I've represented, and the vast majority of them are from the global majority, meaning not white European folks. So learning from them and believing in their expertise, their lived experience, their wisdom, and learning from their resilience and their beauty and their courage is what brings me here.
Shout out to the elders, the ancestors, all the people that's been in this fight for so long. Tiara?
Hey, Al, Tiara here, share pronouns. I think for me, just being a trans woman coming from Zimbabwe, born and raised in Zimbabwe, for me, there's always been the struggle to be able to find a safe space, right, in a country that already criminalizes who we are as trans people, it's just as queer people in general. Where I did back home with the organization I used to work for, just being able to go around the country and meeting other trans folks who are in rural areas, who are in places where there's no access, right, to services that we have for those of us who lived in the city. For me, just really highlighted to see there's a huge gap that will always exist there because one, there's no facilities for us to go to. And the little ones that are there, they are not really very much trans friendly, right? And then also we're already operating in a country that doesn't even want us to be in that country, to exist in that country freely. So they're making the migration to then come to the US for me, which is sold to us as this country where we can come and be safe and our human rights are celebrated and protected. And then to move here and then realize that now I also carry a new identity as a migrant here. It's like, oh, okay, so my journey of struggle and suffering continues. So there's always going to be a need for me either to speak up or for me to want to organize with my folks and to stand up and create strategies that we need to fight back and make sure that we have what we need. So that's what brings me into this work, making sure that we're standing in the gap and showing up for ourselves.
Work, standing in the gap.
I'm so happy to be here with y'all. Lavender Phoenix. We build the power of trans and queer Asian and Pacific Islander people in the Bay Area and beyond. It goes without saying to anyone who's listening that this is such a critical crisis moment for trans people, for migrants. But I also come to this work because of just decades of deep relationship and connection that trans and queer people and migrants have been building. Like Oluchi, you reminded me of like early days of organizing for myself. I remember joining Lavender Phoenix through our youth fellowship, and that first weekend of our really in-depth training, we were not alone. We were also in there with members of Asian Prisoner Support Committee. We were in there with members of Hmong Innovating Politics, and we were deeply all talking about the ways that migration, that economic deprivation, that American wars in our homelands have created the conditions that we're trying to still survive right now. I talked to folks who had recently been incarcerated who were saying, it's always the trans and queer people who are showing up for us in our communities, who are coming to take care of us. How do we show up for them too, for the folks who are inside and outside of detention? So that is the legacy, the decades of work that I think all of us are building on in this conversation.
Absolutely. I mean, you shared so many of those threads that I think the broader public doesn't understand, right? When we're talking about detention, completely they are tied up in the fight against incarceration. And I think people do so many mental gymnastics to separate these fights, and it's really people being harmed by the same systems. I also love that you made a nod to the queer and trans folks on the inside, right, who are organizing in their own ways and holding folks down. So you want to end us off here?
Hi everyone, good to meet everyone here and whoever's listening. My name is Jiménez Palacios. I'm a trans Latina born in Ciudad de Mexico. I have black hair and red lipstick and a nice out pin for folks that are listening. And what keeps me in this work, and I think my first interaction with resisting against state oppression, has been my immigration journey with my parents from Mexico to Los Angeles that once belonged to Mexico back in 2001. And I think from very early on, I knew that there was a sense of distrust with both police, and later on when ICE was created, there was that. And I believe my parents' engagement as well with La Gran Marcha in 2006, which is a huge, huge walkout that took place. And my parents aren't necessarily folks that would describe themselves as organizers or as folks that are in this way, but they were so moved by this that they decided to take us to this massive walkout demanding for justice and humanity. And I think about that moment a lot, especially within this work. And I think what keeps me in this is just witnessing how much we've been robbed by the state, how much we've been forced as children of immigrants and immigrants to be seeing our parents, loved ones, and kin just deteriorate. My passion for wanting some sort of justice and reparation is what continues to keep me here. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Thank you for being here. And I mean, y'all have already shared such important, rich history. I'm wondering if we can start there and dig a little bit more. We know that there's been a lot happening this year around mobilization against ICE, particularly of folks who maybe are new to this part of the movement. And Oluchi, obviously you have Minnesota roots. We'll start with you. What do you want folks to understand about the history that they're inhabiting right now? And what has it been like to witness so much of that history be erased at various points?
Yeah, I'm going to definitely speak in more context of Minnesota because that's where my young organizing actually started in like 2012. Minnesota as a state has always been a very organizing heavy state. So we had Paul Wellstone, who was our senator for a long time, rest in peace, who really shaped how Minnesota organized. And then 2012, 2015, we had a lot of police accountability work. And I think what was erased in that moment is a lot of that work came from queer and trans Black young people, right? The Black Lives Matter movement. And it was also very inherently intersectional. In Minnesota, because of the high population of both Somali folks, West Africans, and just immigrants in general, the Black Lives Matter movement was actually led by a lot of trans and queer migrant folks and folks that were children of immigrants. So like myself, Miski Noor, Hani Ali, Artisha, all these folks were coming with an immigration experience. What we have seen and what we continue to see in the rise of violence in Minneapolis is a perpetuation of what we've been seeing since 2020, right? We saw the rise of organizing happening, and I think that it's actually a response to the ways that Minnesota has shown up for time after time after time again in different fights. I also want to just like underscore within just the immigrant rights movement in general, a lot of it has to do with the main immigrant rights movement has to do with integration. How can we take someone who has left their home country and integrate them into a US citizenship? I think the difference though is when you talk to queer and trans migrant folks, that's actually not our goal, that's not our North Star. Our North Star is not to become US citizens. Our North Star is not to have a piece of paper that tells us that we're valid, because we know that that actually does not save us. We know that from Alex Preddy. We know that from Renee Good. We know that from Sandra Bland. All of these people who have died at the hands of the state were citizens. So the queer and trans migrant movement says, why are people being forced to migrate in the first place? And how do we organize around forced migration? What does it actually look like to undo some of those imperialist oppressions? What does it actually look like for us to not be economically depraved? What does it actually look like for war not to be ravaged in our countries, and so we are forced to migrate? That imperialism and Christian imperialism is not telling us that our ancestral genders are evil or bad or need to be forced out. So just, I wanted to give some context there, and I'll allow Sol to add some more.
Thank you so much, Oluchi, for that context. I really sat with this question, Raquel. What are folks inheriting with the history that they're taking on? And I'm thinking of the younger people who are being activated and beginning to see the system as a whole. I think immigration detention in the US didn't start with ICE, right? The infrastructure goes back to earlier systems under immigration and naturalization services known as INS, with facilities in Port Isabel, which is in South Texas, in the 1950s. And I think folks can start digging there and kind of just seeing that this is part of a larger strategy that has been going on for decades. And we're hitting a point where it's really exploding, if you will. Because what changes after 9/11 is that the system becomes centralized, expanded, and more punitive when it comes to immigrants and trans migrants as well. In 2003, ICE is formed, which essentially absorbs immigration enforcement into this national security framework, which is the perfect system for an abuse of power that this administration or others administrations in the past can extend. So that shift really matters because it's when detention stops being more administrative and it becomes part of much larger enforcement machine, and especially now as we're seeing it today. This system's already producing harm, and trans migrants are already resisting it. By the early 2010s, there's plenty of advocates who have been documenting widespread abuse of LGBTQ migrants in detention. It's sexual assault, it's denial of medical care, and routine use of solitary confinement. In 2011, there's a formal complaint on behalf of LGBTQ detainees, forced ICE to respond by creating its first so-called protective custody unit for queer and trans people in Santa Ana, which ties into the work of many organizers that have protested on Santa Ana, and Familia being a part of also shutting down one of the Santa Ana alongside a coalition of organizations as well. So these later become known as these LGBTQ pods or trans units. We should understand what they actually were. They weren't created out of care. They were created in response to documented abuse that was happening towards trans migrants and queer migrants in detention. And even then, they often reproduce the same harm through isolation and surveillance and neglect.
This actually might be the right time, Mitch, to bring you in because you've represented LGBTQ migrants in detention for over a decade. Can you share what the system actually does to trans folks on the inside from what you've seen throughout your career, and maybe what has ramped up in the last, year or so even?
I just want to warn everyone, that's a very heavy topic, so I'm going to say things and, it could be activating for you, and I think that's important for people to know. It could be intense. I feel like I can finally say this now that everything's being exposed about how inherently violent immigration enforcement is, but all incarceration is torture. And every form of incarceration, particularly in the United States, and everything that is rooted in companies that are based in the United States are torture, and detention is no exception. And I know this for a couple reasons. I know this because I believe people who have survived these places, and I'm talking not just about immigrant detention. And just FYI, that some of those over 25 facilities I mentioned to you are actual prisons with contracts for ICE, or they're privately run detention centers run by private prison companies that run prisons. So they're all prisons. They're all incarceration. But I know this because a couple reasons. One, I believe people, not just the people I've represented, but for example, people at Vote here in New Orleans, Voice of the Experience, which is run by a bunch of people who've spent 10, 20 plus years incarcerated, including here in Angola. When people talk about incarceration came from slavery, in Angola, there is still slavery. And as a matter of fact, there's litigation happening right now where the people who've worked there, and these are generational jobs now, will openly explain that it's slavery. And that's because under the Constitution, we can still have slavery if it is punishment for a crime. In Louisiana, I'm from Miami, but I'm here in New Orleans. I've been in New Orleans for about 6 years. What brought me here was that during the first Trump administration, over the course of one summer, immigrant detention exploded here. People in Louisiana, especially Black organizers in Louisiana and Black communities in Louisiana, fought really hard to decarcerate Louisiana because is no surprise given its history, again, with chattel slavery. It was the incarceration capital of the United States, which is the incarceration capital of the human world. And so they fought to decarcerate. So they closed down a bunch of prisons, some of the worst, including a children's prison, a juvenile prison, that had been previously shut down by the Department of Justice for how horrific it was. So those places were closed out. They were emptied out. Well, Trump got ICE to swoop in and reopen all of them as immigrant detention centers. Same parties, same companies, same prisons, same conditions. How it affects every human being is that incarceration of any kind is physical and psychological torture and a form of premature death. Their lives are literally lessened. Every client I've ever had, if they came in fully healthy, comes out with something they didn't have before. Pre-diabetic, hypertensive, PTSD, all kinds of things, liver condition. People who went in with any kind of disability or illness come out with chronically ill or disabled. It is a system of premature death by being very hidden away from the public eye, but also convincing all of society that the people inside of them are disposable. And so I think what this moment has been so powerful is like, I no longer feel gaslit all the time. I feel less crazy than I have in years. I feel my anxiety starting to lessen. As much as this moment is a reckoning, and yes, it's awful, all the premature death we're witnessing, I don't wish this upon any people, not even white people who were persistently ignorant about it and just didn't listen, because I've held the hands of people inside these systems. I have the physical and mental symptoms of somebody who had to receive all of that grief, that fear of death, that rage, because I have to receive it because the system doesn't care to hear about it at all, and it will not help you. So I have the symptoms, but even if I never did, even if I never touched it, if I had just listened to people who have survived it, if everyone had just listened to the Black elders who have not only lived it, but studied it, and I'm talking about Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and I'm talking about Angela Davis, then we would already know that. And the beautiful thing is they gave us the blueprint. I'm just waiting for the Rainbow Coalition to come back, except this time led by all the women, and just count me in, put me in. That's what I'm waiting for. I'll tell you everything you need to know about the immigration piece of it. And the last thing I'll say is, if you're trans, in addition to just being a human being surviving all that, you have three options in detention. It's either you're going to be put in an explicitly dangerous situation where you can try to hide yourself, where you're being placed in a setting that's with people who are not like you, or that are literally antagonistic to you, and you have to try to hide yourself and suffer that psychological torment of hiding yourself. Or you can be in total isolation, which is a second layer of torture, because solitary confinement is, by even UN standards, torture. Or your third option, and it's the only one I've seen with the best results, is to find your people inside and to try to find strength in numbers, which is why so many folks advocated for the trans units. It's still window dressing. You're still being tortured, and you will be treated as even less human in that separate section. There's going to be special things, special treatments for you. Maybe you won't even get outdoor rec time because you're in that unit, right? So there will be costs, but it's the one that I've seen where the most resilience can be found, because you have community. And community is love. And love is the only thing that gets people through these situations.
Mitch, I want to thank you for taking us there, and just in the realness of the torture that people are experiencing and have been experiencing for a long time. Can't imagine how difficult that is to hear the stories day in and out of people being stripped of their humanity. I do know that the conversation, particularly around who profits from detention, is very important and not one touched on enough.
I would first say, one, we don't do enough corporate campaigns anymore. Shout out to Jesse Jackson. But if you think about the private prison system, we're looking at CoreCivic and Geo Group, right? Which are the two largest private prison companies in the world. They have contracts with ICE, so they are literally making money off of immigrants being in detention. So when you think about the prison industrial complex, you think about crimmigration, which is the intersection between the criminal system and the immigration system, we see that private prisons are making a ton off of immigrants, specifically detaining immigrants. Then we also have different agreements, like we have 287 counties, so that means that counties will actually receive federal funding to basically be ICE agents. Any county police officers, that's what we're seeing. A lot of rural places, even blue states. In Minnesota, there's more than 90 287 agreements throughout the counties. We see that a lot in the South as well. County jails are also detaining migrants. So private prisons and the U.S. government are both getting economically boosted by making sure that immigrants are criminalized.
There's not enough corporate campaigns to really choke out the corporations that benefit from the suffering. I think, just to name a couple to add to Oluchi's already, to the GeoCorp and the CoreCivic, of course, Amazon, Microsoft, Akame, Oracle, Salesforce, IBM, ServiceNow, and Google. This is coming from the Detention Watch Network toolkit as well, which provides wonderful resources that really track down where the money is going through, and definitely something for anyone listening to take a look at as well.
And can I add something about this piece that I think is really important? Is that who doesn't benefit from this and who actually doesn't profit from this is any local community, any local place that invites us in thinking it's going to bring them good jobs. Because this violence work is like a fast track to premature death as well. They don't care. We need to do more to help folks that are stuck in these labor forces, because they live in areas where they don't have other options. And that's how racial capitalism has evolved. That's how far gone we are, that the only jobs left are violence work. And when you commit violence against other people, which can look like anything from being a correctional officer and having to cage people day in and day out, your body, your soul knows that that's violent. Even if you gaslight yourself every single day that it's not. I've worked for years with these people, and some of them have been are Black women who have been whistleblowers. That's how we got a detention center closed down in Georgia, was because of a nurse named Dawn Wooten. And so not enough is talked about the fact that the only people who profit from this are pre-existing wealthy billionaire people. Yes, they divert it all into different companies and they package it to look like jobs, but it's not. And a lot of these places, they don't have all the basic human things that they need. Winfield, Louisiana, they have this enormous detention center. It was supposed to promise XYZ in the third. It barely produced any work. The work, again, is not good. It's dangerous. They didn't provide protections for people during COVID. They wanted everyone working there all the time. Guards died. The conditions are deplorable for you. You're in a cage all day long. You're going to get depressed. You're going to get anxious. And on top of that, they're deteriorating all the time because it's all about the bottom line. The food in there, sometimes you're forced to eat it. It's disgusting. And Winfield, Louisiana has no clean drinking water. And by the way, this is something that is deeply affecting so many cities across the United States. It's more and more affecting New Orleans. And so what I want to be super clear about is this, they sell it like it's going to produce something, like a good paying job, and it is absolutely horrible. And I'm really looking forward to seeing those folks unionize, because we need to center the experiences of people who survive these systems.
Thank you, Mitch. Tiara, I want to bring you in here, you and Yuan, to really talk about some of the solutions that are being innovated within migrant communities. I know, Tiara, you have a background, of course, with coordinating so many different things, getting people connected to health services, housing, whether it was back in Zimbabwe or in DC. Can you talk a little bit more about the work that you've done to ensure that people have the dignified treatment that they deserve?
Yes. Thank you so much for that, Raquel. I think one of the things that we often leave out of the conversation is the things that people need, mostly for us trans migrants when we get here on the ground. Because for most of us, when we are coming here, we are leaving our homes that become situations, as I like to call it. For the most part, these are life-threatening situations. That's why we're being forced to leave our homes to come and start a new life here. So most of the times, people don't really have a plan to say, hey, I'm going to go here because I know somebody and I'm going to do A, B, C, D. No. The most important thing is I need to get out of here and I need to get somewhere safe. I'll figure it out once I get there. And I think that's where most of the work then starts. As somebody who also went through it myself, I was homeless in New York. I had to bounce from one shelter to the other, from one church to the other. And when you get there, it's all about numbers. If there's 19 beds for that night and you're number 20, sorry, you don't get a bed today and you have to run across the city to another church. Most likely you also not get there in time. And outside of that, you still need to be able to make sure that you're healthy. How do you access healthcare if you don't even have insurance? It's not even documented in the system in this country. And even if you want to take those steps to be able to say, hey, let me get myself documented as required by law, how do you even follow that if you don't have someone holding your hand? What does that even look like? We have folks here who've been 20 years in, still in line waiting. I just got my asylum granted last year, 8 years in of waiting. What does that look like for me to be able to still navigate life? And now the rules keep changing each and every day. We're now going to get 5-year work authorization. They've been reduced to 18 months. And now you have to pay for them to apply. You have to pay for them to reapply and renew it when it expires. And there's a lapse. There's also a backlog time for them to process your documents to be able to get them. So when you talk about what does it look like for folks to be able to be treated with dignity, is also understanding and correcting the narrative that they've always wanted to push when it comes to trans rights. It's like we're asking for a special set of rights. We are not. What we're just asking is an intentional extension and application of what everybody else is already accessing. Trans people, we deserve to access public spaces without any fear of being attacked or harassed. If we need to go and access services, we need to be able to go and access those services without any scrutiny. Trans youth deserve to be supported and protected with unwavering, without even questioning, why are we even doing this? And without that being misrepresented, as they always love to do, misrepresent our support for trans youth as groomers and pedophiles, which we are not. And also just really correcting the narrative around trans people existing in public spaces as people who are harmful. Like what we're just asking is to be able to access all these spaces and all these services that everybody else is already accessing without us being singled out for our gender identity, our expression, and how we show up into these spaces. So I think that's one of the things that gives me pleasure and comfort, to know that as community, we have been resilient enough to create our own systems of being able to open our doors to each other, creating strategies that work for us. And I think one of the things that has worked very, very well, especially for me in the DMV area, is we do have a network where we can be able to reach out to each other and say, hey, what is it that you need? I know somebody that might be able to give you what you need. And if we don't know, we can reach out to somebody else who's going to figure it out for us, right? And us being able to be in community and in connection with each other and being intentional about the things that we are doing and how we are sourcing for resources for our community is what has been restoring dignity for our folks. And just knowing that we are moving as a community in unison in that way gives me a sense of relief. We're gonna be all right. We'll make it just fine.
Shout out to community. That's always like the point of connection for anything, any kind of care you need, any kind of safety or security in migrant communities and trans communities and the blend of all these communities. We often, again, see kind of a siloing of AAPI migrant community from these broader discussions as well. And the work that you've been doing, building power, emphasizing joy as well. I know you worked on a campaign that emphasized joy in AAPI migrant communities, but can you talk about maybe what people have been missing in terms of the power being built amongst queer and trans AAPI migrants?
Yeah, thanks for that, Raquel. I definitely can. I'm just also feeling really touched by what everyone else said. And I think it's no coincidence that we started with history. You know, Oluchi and Sol, you started us off so beautifully there. And I really think that if people listening want to understand the depth of violence, the depth of the challenges that Asian trans migrant communities face today, Oluchi, you alluded to this earlier. We really also need to understand the breadth of trans life across the histories of so many of our diasporas. Being trans is not new for our people. Being trans and gender expansive is not new for our people. We have existed in so many forms throughout Asia, throughout the Pacific, throughout the world, as long as our people have existed. In places, you know, like the Philippines and in Hawaii, gender expansive people played critical roles in the spiritual, the social, the political lives of our communities. And it was no coincidence that one of the first acts of empire in so many of our homelands was to label our lives as deviant, as things to be feared, and as things to be erased. In the same way, the violence that we're seeing today really comes from these roots. At Lavender Phoenix, our members and the communities that we belong to, we are here because of centuries of economic devastation. We are here because we have so many members who are refugees and children of refugees of wars waged in Southeast Asia and beyond. And I think so many of us, we are here because we hope that we could escape the violence by coming to the heart of it. But that violence is continuing every single day. We only have to look at and honor and remember the lives of people like Jennifer Laude, a Filipina trans woman who was killed by an American Marine who is stationed on a local base in her homeland, one of literally thousands of those bases that are scattered throughout the homelands of the people, the communities we're speaking to today. So I think this connection we're trying to make between the fight for trans people, the dignity of migrants, the things that we've all lived through tell us that they've always actually been the same struggle, that trans people can't be safe until we end the profit and war machine that makes life harder in our homelands. And we can't win safety for migrant people until we can hold gender liberation and the dignity of trans people at the heart of it. I think at Lavender Phoenix, you know, just to be more specific, all of our work takes place exactly at this front. It shows up when we're training folks across the Bay on de-escalation, how to keep yourself safe without relying on the police, so that you can show up and keep your community safe and disrupt ICE activities. It shows up in our healing justice work where our members are just making space to process both the beauty and also the really complex traumas and challenges of our trans and migrant journeys with each other. And it also shows up with our partners. We hold our work with formations like Grassroots Asians Rising or Asian Prisoner Support Committee really deeply because we are seeing the ways that the right is not just building their base among people who already don't like migrants. They are coming after Black and Brown communities and trying to build their influence in our communities by demonizing trans people. And so we're also having to look really seriously about, with our partners who are building working class power in Asian and Pacific Islander communities, how are we having really deep and thoughtful conversations about gender liberation so that we are not leaving our broader communities exposed to these advances from the right? That's what some of our work looks like today.
I'm also curious what it's going to take for us to build more coalition between different migrant communities, but also how do we get the broader public to start understanding that everything that's happening to all migrant communities is happening to them as well at the same time. Essentially, that all of our liberation is bound together. So I know it's a big question, but it's really about how do we share a new narrative that brings together our struggles and also brings these solutions together too.
I think the beginning would be to correct the narrative of them versus us, right? And just making folks understand that the only them versus us that should exist is the people, is the system. Because I feel like as trans people, people do capitalize on us being the others on the other side. So whatever communication that's happening or strategy that's being put together, there's always a collective of community without us in it, because we are othered in those conversations. So if we start to have those conversations and actually make them see that, hey, everything that you're going through, we are going through it as well. When we are in Black spaces and they talk about Black issues and single out trans folks as if we're not existing being Black and trans at the same time, as if we don't experience the same things that folks are experiencing, I think that would be the beginning of the conversation to say, hey, we are all being attacked by the same system. There might be a couple of variations of things or degrees to what we're experiencing, but the only them versus us that should be there is us, the people, and them is the system. I think that would be a great point to begin.
I think for me, it's more about like what we're doing next and that we're going to do it all together. I've seen this a lot. Certain movements started to break free those silos. Black Lives Matter was one, and that continues to be one. I think now with Free Palestine and the fact that that Free Palestine movement is expanding into everything, into free all colonized places, into free all colonized people, into freeing ourselves from colonized thinking and colonized existence. Those groups that are organizing are extremely intersectional. Like, we're already there. We're not having to convince, we're at the table. The Palestinian youth movement folks, the abolitionist racial justice folks, the disability justice folks, they invite all of us to the table. The trans folks are always invited, and vice versa. We're all working together. We all know each other. Like, at least here in this sacred city of New Orleans, we're there, and it's just about how can we get stronger and how can we actually pull our resources together and what's the game plan. And I think the game plan has to be that we collectively are removing as much of our energy, labor, money, talent, brilliance from those systems, from all of those systems, and because they're all a racial violence system. The prison system is just one of, if not the worst, most violent one, but they're all causing our premature death. Our healthcare system, that's definitely causing all of us our premature death. And per usual, Black folks, trans people, disabled people been saying that's true, and it's happening to everybody. The education system. I mean, let's be real. So what we need to be doing is divesting from those and investing in each other as much as possible, as locally as possible, from that global lens. We are a people on a planet, and the people who are most separated from their humanity and from their true nature as being a part of everything and truly severed from sacred indigenous cultures, Black and indigenous cultures that for centuries stewarded these lands, are the ones running shit at the expense of all of us. Let's go. I know that's very big picture, but I just feel like it's so important to go there because it's what's keeping my hope alive for anything. When I see that 60 plus countries are organizing yet another flotilla to Palestine, when I saw that people in Cuba are starving to death, and yet, boom, another flotilla was being organized, and I hear the letters coming from these people in these prisons, and you're talking about basically citizens of their countries stepping in where the government is failing and actually making a difference. Even with the flotillas, I'll give you a perfect example. People say, oh, well, it didn't do anything. Didn't it? Because there was one time where all of the Israeli, their version of the Marines, the Navy folks, were so busy stopping the flotillas that for the first time in months, Palestinian fishers were able to get fish to feed their families. It broke starvation for so many people. And that's just one example of the difference that it makes. Or just having the words Free Palestine on as many lips as possible, which then forced everyone to say, and Free Congo, and Free Sudan. And you see where it moves forward, right? And that we here in the belly of the beast, we are all part of that. We are all part of that. It's not a coincidence that what Yuan was saying, that they demonize trans people and they made us such a focal point, and that the Dems and the Republicans pretend to strongly disagree on this one issue because they agree with pretty much everything else. They have the same shitty war policies, the same shitty economic policies, and they made us this focal point, and they thought they could get away with it because we're such a small percentage of the population. They thought this is an easy mark. Easy, right? But they fucked up because we're powerful. It is easier for us as people who transgress something as rigid and totally made up as gender that we can tap into that magic, that ancestral magic and spirituality that they were trying to force us to forget. So I'm excited. I see the young people, they're brilliant, they're beautiful, they're determined, they have so much energy, and they deserve for us to keep hope alive and to fight like hell.
I really want to invite people who work with and organize communities that are not trans migrants to build a real relational resilience towards transphobia in your communities. One of our most amazing partner organizations, they were getting mailers sent to their members that were spouting transphobic nonsense to pull those members towards the right. And instead of ignoring that, instead of saying our members aren't there yet, they sat their members down and talked about how those same mailers were coming from the same people who were spreading Islamophobic and xenophobic rhetoric in their city. And they pushed back on transphobia in that way. So I want to invite people to really develop that deep relational resilience. We need to build a broader left that can win governing power in this country. And we need trans people not just to be a piece that's used as a talking point when it's convenient, but to be at the center of the story, of the political power, and of the leadership. We need to be able to build that power, and we need trans people to be at the center of it.
I definitely plus to what everyone has been naming. If you stand in your own power and if you are in your own identity, it allows for people to see you in your identity. And I think about that when I think about my trans identity. To Ewan's point about partner organizations, BLMP helps co-host and lead the Texas Black Migrant Ecosystem, a coalition of different Black migrant organizations and organizers and leaders here in Texas, which is the first of its kind. And a lot of those organizations are not queer or trans centering at all. Yet they all have a commitment and dedication to be led by a Black queer trans organization. And so when I'm in those spaces, I come in as my very trans self. And I'm able to actually lead not as a trans person, but be witnessed as a trans person. An interpersonal example of this, I attract a lot of cis straight men who revere me as a person that they can have emotional conversations with. One of the things that they always say is damn, I can't have these conversations with my homeboys or my homies or my friends. And I'm that's really weird. I don't understand why you don't think that you can have this conversation. But I think to that point, I think that people need to understand that, one, transphobia is not a monopoly that only trans people experience, right? And also that gender politics, as Mitch said, this structure of gender actually affects how you are able to be in relationship with other people. Once that is broken down with trans people, folks will understand that this is actually a fight that I need to be a part of as well. So again, shout out to Gender Liberation Movement, who has this as a focal point in their organizing and their praxis. But I would just say, to build coalition, people need to see themselves in the fight. Even when we think about forced migration, you can be a citizen of the United States and experience forced migration. We call that internally displaced people, or IDPs. When we think about the highway system that was created and how it split Black communities apart, even in Minneapolis and St. Paul, it completely decimated the Rondo neighborhood, which was a primarily Black neighborhood, and people had to move and they were forced to migrate. That is a smaller microcosm of forced migration. Now think about that, and think about that as a person of a different nation who now has to go to a different country, different customs, different culture. So once we can see ourselves in a fight, it allows us to actually be in that fight with the folks that are experiencing it the hardest.
Yeah, I love what everyone has been saying. And I feel like, yeah, I'll never get tired of hearing that we have always existed and that we've always been here. So I appreciate hearing that a lot throughout. And I think something I'm sitting with is specifically to maybe queer citizens and that are trying to interact with immigrants who are queer as well, making intentional relationship with people. I wish I would see more, whether that's organizations or clubs or spaces, to really become places where we can just interact, because I don't think that there's enough of those spaces alone. Because I think while a lot of queer citizens may align with yes, I'm for the liberation of trans migrants, how does it look like for you to practice being in relationship with trans migrants beyond saying I'm for you? So I think I would love to see that a lot more, and I'm craving for spaces like that for sure. And I hope that we can create them together.
So what I'm hearing is deep, intentional community building, connection, not treating people's experiences and lives like trends, because we know how that goes. I want to thank you all for all of your brilliance, all of your power, all the passion, the history, the vision building. This is just a taste of all of the brilliance of these individual folks and the movements that they are leading. So I want to thank Yuan, Tiara, Oluchi, Sol, and Mitch. Everything that y'all have shared is so a part, as you said, Oluchi, of what we're trying to be in community with here at Gender Liberation Movement. And I appreciate y'all for elevating always the realness of what's happening and what people can do to shift it.